Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Diversifying Capacities, our talk about writing, mentoring, and publishing beyond borders. I'm Aisha Jahan, a postdoctoral researcher on the AHRC-funded Diverse Capacities. Diverse Capacities is a project headed by Professor Will May and co-run by Professor Dan Ashton. We're based in the Southampton Institute of Arts and Humanities at the University of Southampton. At Diverse Capacities, we're interested in building a knowledge exchange network for creative industries in our Solent region. We're also particularly interested in how national and international expertise can build and strengthen local networks. Today, we hope to encourage knowledge exchange and understanding through the national and international network that the wonderful Sushmita Bhattacharya and I have fostered through a project we co-run called Write Beyond Borders. Write Beyond Borders is a mentoring project that pairs emerging writers of South Asian origin with established South Asian writers. These writers, through their experience, generosity, and dedication, help their mentees develop their craft and grow in confidence as writers. And it's 4 of these wonderful Write Beyond Borders mentors who will speak to you today. Our discussion today is not just about providing underrepresented writers an opportunity to develop their craft and share their stories. It's also about building structures that will allow them to share the stories that they want to write, about experiences that matter to them, and in languages that they feel belong to them too. This talk bridges local, national, and international experiences of mentoring, writing, and publishing. Our speakers are Sabine Javeri, who is an author, translator, and senior lecturer of writing and global literature at New York University in Abu Dhabi. Geetha Raleigh, who is a poet, children's writer, and doctor who teaches creative writing at Imperial College London. Amitha Murray, a writer and academic based in London, who is the author of the Unladylike Regency romance series. And Farah Ghaznavi, who is a writer, mentorship specialist, and development worker based in Bangladesh, whose stories have been published in journals across the world. Before our speakers take center stage, I'd like to explain the structure of the event. The 4 writers will speak in the first half of the event, and the second half will be an opportunity for Q&A. Our writers would love to answer your questions, but just to save time, please could you put your questions in the chat, and we will then ask them on your behalf. We'll try to cover as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So let's begin with our first speaker, Farah Ghaznavi. Farah will start us off by sharing some of the benefits and challenges of mentoring across cultures and borders. Thank you, Farah. Farah, you're muted.
Hello, everyone. My talk today focuses on drawing lessons from the Write Beyond Borders project, and I want to thank everyone there who has shared their thoughts with me on this topic. Many years of mentoring experience in diverse arenas, from the international development sector to working as a feminist mentor, building young women's leadership capacities here in South Asia, has given me some appreciation for the challenges and benefits offered by a scheme like WBB. What I found particularly interesting about this project was its geographical specificity, namely the choice of mentees with links to the South Asia region and the selection of mentors accordingly. Often projects like this involve mentors from the global north interacting either with mentees from their part of the world or from the global south. The number of international schemes offering what is essentially south-to-south mentorship is still somewhat limited. And it's that aspect of the cross-border mentoring in WBB that was most interesting for me. When I discussed their writing samples with my 2 mentees, both of whom are from Pakistan, it threw up some interesting connections, as well as a few potentially awkward ones. Those at all familiar with the history of Bangladesh will know that the bloody War of Independence from Pakistan in 1971 involved a massacre of a civilian population and also one of the earliest recorded instances of rape being used as a policy measure as a weapon of war. It left massive psychological scars, and its echoes still reverberate in the Bengali psyche, as evidenced in literature coming out of the region today. The subsequent rewriting of history in Pakistan has meant that younger generations are often unaware of the atrocities. So while I am grateful for my many Pakistani friends of different generations, whenever I meet new people, I always hope that they hold reasonably progressive views on contemporary issues as well as about their country's past. Fortunately for me, both my mentees turned out to be not only liberal and well-informed, but delightful individuals as well as talented writers. So I mention this only as an example of how regional fault lines may require navigating on a project of this kind, which can be a challenge. To again use the example of Bangladesh's War of Independence, it is a source of pride to most Bangladeshis, viewed or ignored as a humiliating piece of history by Pakistanis with a certain mindset, and referred by many in the Indian establishment as the Third Indo-Pak War, with any mention of Bangladesh being glaringly absent from that title. Hence, with a shared history, especially one that does not always come out of a shared perspective, one may consider it wise, at least initially, to proceed with a little discretion. On the plus side, it is probably safe to say that having a degree of familiarity with sociocultural attitudes from the region to which mentor and mentee are both linked is a definite advantage, particularly in making it easier to critique stories set within that context or informed by it. For example, in a patriarchal society where girls' clothing is often heavily influenced by the preferences of their elders, the battle over a piece of red lingerie that featured in one of my mentees' stories acted as a form of shorthand about the relationship between the mother and daughter in the story. The power dynamics at play were easy enough to recognize for a mentor like myself, someone who is intimately familiar with such intergenerational conflicts in South Asian families. The very fact that the humorous aspect of those familial tensions and the defiance involved was clearly understood by both of us created an immediate opportunity for Zara and me to bond. The same was true in a number of other instances during the mentoring process with both Aisha and Zara. Sharing this kind of common understanding also helps when it comes to establishing a sense of authenticity, something which I feel very strongly about. There are times when, due to a desire to be published or an excess of enthusiasm to write a story that is truly original, a writer will pursue an idea that is not factually accurate or particularly well thought out. I encountered an example of this when a young student in a writing workshop, not part of WBB, told me that he wanted to write a story about female genital mutilation set in Bangladesh. When I pointed out that this was not a common cultural practice in the country and might be misleading to readers unfamiliar with Bangladesh, he replied that he was aware of that, but he simply wanted to do something that hadn't been done before. In the end, thankfully, he agreed to reconsider the matter. For me, this illustrates the fact that there is a definite advantage to having some cultural references in common when it comes to the mentor-mentee relationship. With Right Beyond Borders, I found, for example, that detailed knowledge of events regarding the partition of India in 1947 was useful in helping me critique a piece by one of my Pakistani mentees. We were able to discuss the events portrayed in her story without either of us requiring further background information. Continuing on the theme of authenticity, when it comes to the thorny subject of publication, sometimes this is precisely the issue that rears its head. And painful decisions may be required when it comes to crunch time. Descriptions of monsoon romances, bejeweled elephants at Indian weddings, and as one South Asian writer friend of mine lamented, frequent references to mango-shaped breasts may feed into appealing stereotypes, but it can be harder to sell narratives that don't fit publishers' ideas of what constitutes a suitable story from a country they may not know that much about. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie spoke eloquently in her excellent TED Talk about the dangers of a single story, and many of us have already experienced this. I ended up pulling an accepted story from a prestigious American literary journal because at the final stage, I was asked to create a social worker character in a Bangladeshi village so that American audiences would, quote, have someone to relate to, whilst reading the story of a village woman with mental health issues. The absurdity of this proposal will be evident to anyone who knows anything about Bangladeshi or Pakistani or Indian or Nepali villages, and the general lack of social workers that prevails even in the urban centers of our countries. In the end, I decided against making those changes. And while another writer might, for their own very valid reasons, have made a different decision, the point is that those of us writing from what is sometimes described as the periphery may well have a comparative advantage in working with emerging writers tied to the region, because our mentees may find themselves encountering the same reductive stereotypes that favor a single narrative in stories emanating from this region. My fellow mentors presenting here will address such common concerns, including how best to approach publishers who may view South Asian writing as being limited to a niche market, and how to access the opportunities that do exist for writers of South Asian extraction, like Write Beyond Borders. Their understanding of these issues and the expertise that they have developed to address them are yet another reason why I feel that a project like WBB has something important, something extra to offer those who are mentored under its auspices. This kind of scheme may allow for a more iterative and mutually enriching process that takes into account certain specifics than the pairing of those from very different cultures or countries in schemes favoring a North-South equation. While those can, of course, be equally productive, there may also be other sensitivities involved, around colonial history and center-periphery politics, for example. Thus, the cross-border mentoring demonstrated in Write Beyond Borders, which is loosely based on ties to a specific geographical region and the cultures based there that have elements in common, can provide added dimensions that enrich both the process itself and the mentor-mentee interactions and bonding. Thank you. And with that, I will hand over to Geeta Rale, who will talk about mentoring poets who write in a language that is not their mother tongue.
Thank you so much, Farah. That was just such a wonderful run through of some of the opportunities, I guess, as well as the challenges which come with this great project. So I'm going to actually talk about something that might seem a little bit specific, but I think this was just such a great opportunity to connect with people in this area that I wanted to talk about the use in poetry broadly of words from another language, frequently what we tend to term the mother tongue. And this is very much an exploration, this brief paper. It's tentative, questioning, and I very much hope that others will join in bringing their perspectives. And I think Aisha is going to share the poems with you all so you can have the whole poem. I'm going to quote from these poems briefly. But let me explain, first of all, why am I interested in this? Well, firstly, I teach creative writing in an institution, Imperial College, where there are many international students. Secondly, this is a device I see frequently used by South Asian poets, and in fact, I've used it myself. And what I haven't seen much of in the literature is the naming, the analyzing, or the critiquing of what exactly is going on when we incorporate, I use that word deliberately, the mother tongue language into our English poetry. And I'm talking about poetry today, but much of this also applies to prose. I've tried to kind of divide this in a very loose way. I guess using the kind of aesthetic theory of India and other South Asian countries, where we talk about feelings rather than giving things intellectual names. So let's call the first section I'm going to talk about laughter. One term that I've seen in the literature applied to this kind of verse is macaronic. And macaronic is a term which means any verse mixing two or more languages together. Excuse me. It was first used for a mixture of Latin and Italian, and mainly for comic or burlesque verse, the comedy arising from the difference between these high and low registers. An example would be one of our most well-known South Asian poets in Britain, Daljit Nagra, who uses both humor and wordplay, mixing languages up, code switching. In fact, he's even coined his own term, Punglish, a mixture of Punjabi and English for some of his poems. And just to give you an example, I'm going to read a little bit from one of his most anthologized poems. It's actually on the GCSE syllabus. My daughter's just finished hers, so she was analyzing this poem. And it's called Sing Song. And Sing Song, of course, in itself is a pun on the term sing-song, which is often in a slightly derogatory way used to describe the kind of Indian accent or Indianized English. And he says, I run just one of my daddy's shops from 9 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And he want me to not have a break, but when nobody in, I duty lock, 'cause up the stairs is my newly bride. We sharing chapati, we sharing the chutney, after we have made love, like we rowing through Putney. And it goes on in this vein. Now, I've seen Nagwa criticized somewhat for using this kind of creolized sort of language, but in a sense, this macaronic form can be seen as a poetics, which has an element of conviviality in the sociological sense, where we talk about different communities living together, as we do in London and other major urban centres in the UK. And in a sense, I think this use that he has of Indian words and Indian or Punjabi phrasing operates to sort of disrupt the elevated poetic English that we're encouraged to use, particularly in poetry, I think, much as the immigrant grocery store in his poem erupts in its messy, uncontained, but colourful way onto the kind of grey English street. So this is just to recognise that that's one mode I have seen recognised and critiqued. But another mode of use of the mother tongue within the South Asian and other diasporas is with a strong overlay of loss. The mother tongue for us is linked to the motherland. And losing our mother tongue, as lots of us were encouraged to do as children, because you're encouraged to sort of speak English, it's often linked with loss of community, loss of culture, even losing one's own sense of belonging. This is not confined to the diaspora, because some writers within South Asia, during conversations, I found that they also think that their language is not merely undervalued because of the dominance of English, not only in literature, but in commerce and in science, but they actually find that their own language is slipping away and forgotten because of their use of English in literature, and forgetting the language that is your most intimate thing, one of the first things you ever knew or heard, means that you kind of forget yourself in a way. And there's another poem which is also on the GCSE syllabus. I've chosen poems which are, these are probably the only Asian poets that some people will ever read in their lives because they're on the GCSE English syllabus. It's Search for My Tongue by Sujata Bhatt, where she starts off saying, I ask you, what would you do if you had two tongues in your mouth and you lost the first one, the mother tongue, and could not really know the other, the foreign tongue? And it goes on for some time, but then she has a segment that's in Gujarati, a kind of written in English alphabet Gujarati, where she says, Mari bhacha pache aveche, and she talks about the tongue being cut off at the root and growing again from this shoot in her dreams. And I think that's a very beautiful evocation of this loss, which is another theme that I find, when we're using these mother tongue words, there's a strong overlay of love and loss in our use as poets. A third way in which the mother tongue can be used, and something that poets are particularly fond of, is wordplay. So let's call this play. We open up a multiplicity of meanings, or we can imply the untranslatable, something that we cannot carry across to our new language. And an example of this is a beautiful poem by an Afghani poet, an Afghani American poet. It's called Ghazal for Mothers and Tongues by Sahar Muradi. And she begins by saying, it may be a broken, a shrill mother tongue, but I'm raising my daughter in my ill mother tongue. And she has a few more verses, but then she refers to the Dari words for certain animals that she's teaching her daughter, her little daughter. A bat is a leather butterfly, turtle, a stone frog, Dari 1, English nil, mother tongue. We are writing our own kitab, you and I. Oh, the things they try to kill, mothers and tongues. So I think that's another really beautiful way that I've seen poets using the mother tongue, their language, to kind of multiply the meanings and to really expand the English language in a way by using our words and expanding them in poetry. The last mode that I want to talk about, and I'm hoping that Sabine will talk a little bit more about this, because this is something I've only really come across recently. Let's call it crossing. And recently I came across this term exophony, which is writing in a language that is not your own. And it carries this overtone, I think, of, in some sense, being an exile from language. I came across it through a writer called Yoko Tawada, who writes in both Japanese, her native language, and German. And of course, as poets and writers, we are alert to the possibilities of language, not only meaning and the sound, the music of language, but also to the way that actually writing can shift our own sense of belonging and unbelonging, our making and our unmaking of the self. And the in-between space of multilinguality, which a lot of our mentees share, because although they're poets within South Asia and the diaspora, they are writing in English predominantly. That in-betweenness can be a very creative space. Jhumpa Lahiri, who wrote in English and now writes predominantly in Italian, has also used this term, exophony. According to Wikipedia, it's defined as a practice of creative writing in a language that is not one's mother tongue. Lahiri, in a podcast I was listening to, spoke of how, for her, because she was brought up speaking Bengali as her mother tongue, but never learned to read or write it, in a sense, every language is a foreign language for her. And her move to Rome geographically and her subsequent strong desire to be able to write in Italian came from her perception of English, American English, as a language she was sort of forced to assimilate into, unlike Italian, which she chose with love, with desire. And writing in English, whether in South Asia or the diaspora, we are all too aware of how these dynamics of power and desire operate in our various languages. Yoko Tawada explains, when asked why she writes not only in German but also in Japanese, she says, "I don't aspire to cross the border. I want to reside within it. There is something more important than language in that moment of hesitation, a sense that I can truly feel the border." The feminist theorist Rosie Braidotti has used this term nomadic subjectivity to describe those of us who as subjects are not unitary, are not one, but are split, complex, nomadic, moving between multiple ways of belonging. And the last poem I'm going to use as an example is by Solmaz Sharif, who is an Iranian-American poet. And in her brief, brutal poem, we see a kind of reversal, because she's rendering English or French words in the way that Farsi-speaking people, because that's her mother tongue, would say them. And the sinister nature of some of these words, dictator, benzene, imperialism, undercuts the fun of the wordplay and makes us think twice about what these words really mean and what using particular words in a particular language mean. So in conclusion, whether using a mother tongue to disrupt or interrogate, to play or to mourn, poets have used this border between Anglophone writing and their mother tongues to create some really original and powerful work. I'll end there. Thank you. So I'm now going to introduce our next speaker. I will now hand over to Sabine Javeri, who will talk about the transformative power of forming a global literary community and about the impact of global Englishes on writing. I'm eager to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Geeta. I hope you can all hear me. Hello. Thank you so much for bearing with me today. And thank you, Geeta and Farah. It's been so enriching hearing you both talk about the mentoring experience, and I feel I can only add to what has already been mentioned. What I'll try and do right now is I will focus my talk on the transformative power of forming a global literary community, as well as on the awareness and acknowledgement of global Englishes. In my talk, I will try to connect the two to show how together this can create a more inclusive experience for mentoring. Mentoring, I believe, is a mutual learning experience, and despite the traditional hierarchies, mentors learn just as much from their mentees. So today, I am going to explore how connecting with writers, with other writers and readers from diverse cultural backgrounds can enrich our perspectives, inspire new ideas, and foster a deeper understanding of different literary traditions. Through shared experiences and collaborative projects, a global literary community can break down barriers, promote cross cultural dialogue, and provide a support network that nurtures creativity and resilience in the face of challenges. This discussion is, I think, particularly valuable for writers looking to expand their horizons and engage with a broader audience. Um, because it focuses on the impact of these global literary connections on individual and collective growth while staying true to their authentic voice. And in order to explain what I mean by that authentic voice, I'm going to start by talking about my own very recent mentoring experience. Farah and Geeta have already touched upon this, so I'm going to expand a bit more on that. So I have been fortunate enough to participate in WBB's initiative twice. I think it's an excellent cross-border, cross-cultural digital mentoring experience. So although it's been immensely rewarding and enriching, it has also presented some challenges, which in turn have led me to reconsider what makes mentoring truly effective. So we talked about the challenges of stereotypes. We talked about the challenges of writing in English as a second language. What I want to talk about now is how language barriers, world Englishes, and differing cultural contexts sometimes make it difficult to stay authentic to the nuances of a writer's work. Working with global Englishes while keeping Western publishing standards in mind requires balancing authenticity with accessibility of expression. And by accessibility, I mean standardized English. So while this is not just limited to this mentoring experience, because I teach writing to a very diverse group of students from all over the world at NYU Abu Dhabi, for the purposes of this talk, I am referring to my most recent mentoring round with the WBB, where I was paired with a writer from a minority Muslim community in India. He wrote in English about the issues affecting his community, and they were extremely powerful stories, but they were very nuanced in the way that they were expressed. While I tried to be constructive in my editorial critique, I found that much was lost when translating his experiences into a more standardized form of English. So while I was encouraging him to write in his own authentic voice, I was also wondering whether the story may be better communicated in Urdu, perhaps, rather than English as a second language. However, after much dialogue, I understood that he felt most comfortable writing in English. Why? Because he did not think of it as a second language. He grew up speaking English. English was not a second language for him, just like it isn't for many of my other students from post-colonial countries such as Pakistan, Singapore, or even the USA, just to name a few. So this experience brought the idea of global Englishes into a much sharper focus for me. I began to think that we often think of English as a sort of a monolithic universal language, but there are many different kinds of Englishes in the post-colonial world, and not everyone thinks of it as a second language. Many of my creative writing students grow up bilingual. In countries previously colonized by Britain, especially, many people grow up bilingual, speaking both their mother tongue and English. For them, English is not always a foreign language, but perhaps one that has evolved according to the culture and customs of the place, as any living language does. So the difficulty that now arises when editors and publishers try to strip these Englishes of its unique accents, flavors, and originality and veracity is what challenges in translating the authenticity of that writer's voice. And I'll refer now to a very famous essay by Salman Rushdie, English is an Indian Literary Language. It was published in the Northern Anthology of English Literature, I think more than a decade ago. So he argues in it that it's impossible to fight the fact that English is a world language, even if it became so due to colonial and post-colonial domination by Britain and the USA. He argues that in many multilingual countries, English remains the only neutral language for communication. He gives the example of India, where the South has resisted attempts by the North to impose Hindi, and English serves as a neutral medium. Rushdie emphasizes that English literature now has its Indian branch, with many leading Indian writers contributing to it. He argues that all English literatures should be studied together to see that English literature has never been in better shape. But after this particular mentoring experience, I found myself thinking, what kind of English is Rushdie talking about? The English spoken in Britain is not the same as the one in the USA, nor is it the one same in India or Singapore. There are, in fact, many varieties of Englishes, such as Hinglish or Singlish or Spanglish. So, how can we encourage our mentees to be true to the nuances of cultural and linguistic translations without compromising on the Englishes that they write in? And I think this is where the connection comes in. This is where having an inclusive literary community comes in handy. The mentoring process often requires taking the time to nurture, be thoughtful, and this is often in contrast with the Western creative writing model, where the writer being critiqued is often a silent participant. And I refer now to Felicia Rose Chavez's anti-racist writing workshop, How to Decolonize the Creative Writing Classroom, which I would encourage everyone to read if they haven't already. The main idea in this book is to provide a framework for creating inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist writing workshops that emphasizes recognizing challenging systematic oppression within the literary community. It offers practical strategies. Basically, it aims to empower writers and facilitators to address issues of language and representation thoughtfully and effectively in their writing and teaching practices. I drew on these strategies from Chavez's book. And in my mentoring initiative, as I tried to put these into practice, I encouraged my mentees, who was from, as I mentioned, an underserved community in India, to be true to his voice. If the character said the light went instead of there was an electrical valve failure, then that's fine, because that's the character's voice. That's what's true to the character. If the character expresses themselves with Ayla or what to do, it adds to the richness of the writing. It doesn't take away from it. In many cases, it also meant balancing what can often fall into stereotyping. And that was another challenge. How do you balance that sort of orientalization of writing while also maintaining the flavor and the accent of that English without constantly contextualizing and situating the English that the writer is using? And my aim was, as Farah also mentioned, to fight the single story, as Chimananda Adichie puts it, and to ensure that writers from diverse communities also get to express the genuineness of their linguistic and cultural experience while still being accessible to a global audience. As mentors who have experienced this, we can use and share our experiences of publishing and other opportunities without constantly contextualizing or putting ourselves in brackets. I think in mentoring, especially, it is really important to establish these safe spaces within workshops and critiques to allow writers to express their true voice without fear of judgment or marginalization. And one way is to have that wonderful and nurturing global community. I'm just wrapping up now. Sorry, I realized I've run out of time. So I'll just say, to wrap this up, that sharing and emphasizing the importance of voice and experience really encourages writers to draw on their positionality and cultural backgrounds and their different global Englishes as strengths, not weaknesses, highlighting the value of these diverse perspectives in enriching the literary landscape. And balancing feedback is crucial, providing responses that honor the writer's voice and intent rather than pushing them towards more standardized and homogenized forms of English, and basically killing creativity. This involves being aware of and challenging biases that certain linguistic norms favor, promoting visibilities for writers from non-dominant communities, advocating for the publication and promotion of their works by connecting them with publishers who value diverse voices, and resist industry norms that favor homogenization. And I think my colleague is going to talk a bit more about that. I'd just like to end by saying that these fostering these mentorship programs that connect emerging writers with mentors from similar backgrounds really helps writers see their potential and navigate the challenges of the publishing world while really staying true and authentic to their voices. And by integrating these strategies, we can support writers from non-dominant, or as they are known, marginalized communities, in maintaining the genuineness of their English and ensuring that their stories, their voices are heard and valued. And that's what makes initiatives such as the WBB so important and so worthwhile. So thank you so much for listening. And I will now hand over to my colleague Amita, who will discuss more the challenges that these marginalized writers face in the publishing world. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Those were such enriching talks. I was glad that I could just enjoy them and listen to them first. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to start with talking for a second about my granddad, who he was very active in the kind of the anti-colonial independence movement in India back, in the early days of the 1900s, and he was active in the anti-colonial movement, but also worked with Gandhiji's Sevagram, which was a very socialist organization, all about trying to make sure that there was less inequality in the country at the time. While he was active in that movement, at the same time, his bookshelves and the bookshelves that I then inherited as I was growing up were made up of Austen and the Bronte sisters and Thackeray and Dickens and D.H. Lawrence and all of those writers. So it's really interesting. I've now diversified my bookshelf as I've grown up, as I'm now that I'm an adult. But as I was growing up, that was not the case. I was very much influenced by what we call English literature, as were my parents and grandparents. It's funny because what I didn't realize until more recently is that those authors that I grew up reading were writing about the 1800s. And there was a lot missing, because the 1800s, there were two crucial parts of history, colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, both quite connected actually to each other, that were just missing from the authors that I was reading. These were novels that were set often in London or around London, in various cities in this country, but the references to the history that was going on around those characters, the history that was very, very immediate in some ways, the commodities that were being used, the cotton, the tea, the spices, the porcelain, all of that was coming from what was essentially the British Empire, and is part of that history. So it's as a as a writer that I feel that not only do I have to not only do I have to explore those missing histories, not only do I have to explore them, I want to explore them in my way. So referring to what Sabine was saying and a couple of the other speakers were saying about missing stories, voices, homogenization, one of the things that has been very dominant in kind of the way that South Asian writers have written in the past and continue to write today is that we've had spaces in very literary genres of writing in the publishing industry, because the publishing industry tends to put you on a shelf according to the genre that they think you're writing in. When I ask people, could you name South Asian writers of fiction, mostly they say Salman Rushdie, Arundhati Roy, and then they struggle. Jhumpa Lahiri obviously comes up sometimes, and occasionally some other writers, but they do really struggle. And the writers that we do know that are of South Asian origin are or heritage are often in literary spaces and not in commercial genres like romance and mystery and horror and thriller. So to me, I love reading those genres, and I want to see me in those genres. I want to see, people I know in those genres. So my Regency series, I love the Regency genre. It's a really fun, interesting genre, and I really wanted to talk about that, that history that I feel is missing from our stories. I'm just going to read a very, very, very short excerpt, and I wanted to show you the cover of this book because it has a woman. Ooh, I can't quite place it. It has a woman in Regency dress playing cricket, and I thought that was important to show. And then I have a bookmark to go with it of a woman in Regency dress playing the sitar. So I thought I'd show that because, if we are talking about decoloniality, we've got to decolonize all different spaces and genres of literature, not just the literary genres. So very quick excerpt. This is Damien looking at Anya playing the sitar, and he says, she'd been singing on and off for an hour and a half. It wasn't so much that she was a good singer. It wasn't that her voice was all emotion, a conveyance for everything she thought and felt. It was that the music seemed to pass through her. Yet it was more than that. He envied her that connection she had with the sitar, of a lost part of herself that she must have picked up in India when she was little. He had no such connection with Jamaica. No connection with the streets and the food of the place that had been his home until he came to boarding school. And what if he could get his hands on some fried plantain or invite someone over to play the djembe? It would be out of place here, and he didn't want that connection. He even hid it at times. Not because of what people would think of it, but more because it was a schism with himself, the cauterization of what had been his life, his being. He sometimes thought he was a foreigner to himself. I'm just going to read that much. And the reason I wanted to read it is because it addresses so many of the things that we're talking about languages, about displacement, about diaspora, about decolonizing. Because there are parts of ourselves that are allowed in mainstream conversation, and there are parts of ourselves that we don't talk about, that we don't, that aren't in mainstream conversation. And this continues to be an issue because even though there are fantastic programs like this mentoring program, where we pair up with writers from different parts of South Asia, and we can help them develop their voices as writers, which is so important and so critical. But what happens after they are able to publish? What happens once they're published? What happens even when they're looking for contracts with publishers? So I wanted to address that a little bit and kind of look at that split that still exists and the spaces that are still, that are tricky for if you are a writer of color. So a report came out a few years ago. It was by Spread the Word and Goldsmiths, and they pointed out some of the barriers that still exist for Black and brown authors. And they said that the reason that publishing houses say, so the reasons that publishing houses themselves say they find it difficult to have more and more brown and Black authors, is that they said that one, publishing houses think they have an assumption that Black and brown people don't buy books. So that's quite a dangerous and kind of strange assumption as well. So that's something to keep in mind, that publishers still have this assumption. The other thing that publishers tend to do is think that if you're a Black or brown author, that you are writing in niche subjects. So you get put into kind of these brackets of sort of niche themes and topics. And that means, again, that in the mainstream spaces, you might not be seen as a viable option because you're supposedly writing in those niche areas. And then what happens, that the outcome of that is that even if the publishing industry wants to support you and wants to have more diversity, what ends up happening is that, one, you get put in those literary genres where actually that's not necessarily where the big advances often are. That's not who, that's not normally the big contracts. The second thing that happens is, even if you get a really good contract with a really good publisher, as in my case, what then ends up happening is there is still a barrier, in that if they assume all of those things that I said about Black and brown readers not reading or not buying books, and how do we reach them, and we don't know how to reach them, what ends up happening is that you still have to get a really decent promotional and publicity budget in order to be a viable author, and in order to sell loads of books and be visible to diverse audiences. So, and the tricky thing is that we are getting to the point where publishers are looking for more contracts, are developing more contracts with Black and brown authors and their mentorship schemes. But we are still at that stage where we also then need the publisher to back us with a decent publicity budget, and that's where then things get a little bit knotted still, because there are places where we have reached and where we are reaching, but there are some spaces that we still need to kind of fight for. And I think that I wrote an article in the Bookseller the other, it came out about a week ago perhaps, and I was jokingly saying, but also seriously saying, there's a line in it that says, brown people have sex, brown people talk about race, and sometimes we do both on the same day. We don't go into a different room to talk about race. And I think that is that is one of the things that we really have to keep in mind, that for a lot of publishers and for a lot of people generally, talking about race still seems like a difficult thing to do, and something that we still have to kind of make mainstream. So I know that I think I'm running out of time as well. So I will very soon hand over back to Aisha, and questions which we hope we'll get lots of. But just to kind of leave us with this space, this idea that as South Asian writers, readers, academics, the next step that's really needed is that we need to make the published authors that we have more visible. We need to have a community that supports each other and buys each other's books, but also supports each other in ways that white authors and Black authors are doing much more of than we do. So we're, creating those festivals, creating those spaces, creating those panel events, creating those conferences where we can have more South Asian representation, but also South Asian representation across genres and not just one or two. So I'll stop there and hand back to Aisha.
Thank you very much for the talks, all four of you. They were really instructive and perceptive, and on such a wide-ranging number of topics that I think we've all learned a great deal today, and they were all really engaging. Thank you very much. So what we'd like to do is to ask audience members who've been thinking of questions that you'd like to ask either the entire panel or specific members of the panel, please do start to put those questions in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'd like to put a question to start us off to the four mentors on this program. As such experienced mentors, as mentors who've been working across borders and cultures, what is one piece of advice that you could share for other writers and other mentors to build fruitful relationships with mentees who are from a different background to yourself? And please
Can
do.
I say a quick word? Sorry, Aisha, shall I just jump in there? Just very quick. I suppose mine would be, don't be afraid, because I think mentees especially I think there's sometimes a barrier that they think that their writing has to be really excellent or really perfect in order to reach out and kind of discuss it with a mentor. But I think that talking through that fear, sharing work through that fear, I think is a really, really good thing to be able to do with a mentor.
And I think I would add to what Amita just said, but from the other end, which is when you're going in as a mentor, I think it's very, very important to go in without assumptions. You may have certain things in common, or you may have certain ideas about the genre or the kind of writing or the kind of place that the person is coming from, but one size really doesn't fit all. So I at least feel that what you do when you go in is that you spend a lot of time listening, and not just listening to what they're talking about when they're talking about writing, but listening to the way that they're talking, listening to who they are in a way, so that you can then tailor your response in a way that actually supports what that particular mentee needs. And that can be for two Pakistani mentees who need completely different things, and so on. There is no, to go in without the labels, and to be prepared to spend a fair bit of time listening. And I think that was, somebody else touched on this as well. I think one of the things that doesn't always come through, and I think that did for not just me with my mentors, but I think my mentees, but I think some of the others have also mentioned that there has to be a time investment, because unless you're willing to find that time and to be flexible and find ways of working with them, you won't have that. You won't have that opportunity to listen and to learn and to understand who they are. And you need to do that in order to be able to really be the best mentor that you are capable of being with this mentee.
I think everyone's already said everything, but I was just going to say, actually, from the mentee's point of view, we actually get a huge amount from the relationship, a huge amount of joy, a huge amount of learning. So yes, don't be afraid of entering these schemes, because, we're not doing you a favor. I often feel it's the other way around, definitely.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that. And I think just adding on to what everyone else has said, I do believe that it is important to set expectations early on, for both the mentee and the mentor. But most of all, I think it's really important to know that you won't always have all the answers, and as a mentee, know that you won't always know what exactly the question is that you're trying to ask. And it's just, it's dialogue, and it's creating that safe space, and it's remembering that this is a mutual learning experience, that we all learn from each other through sharing. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So we have some questions that are coming in the chat, and I'll read one from Meredith, who's asking, can any of you who have taught in UKHE share any experiences of encouraging writing students to translanguage, write multilingually, or even make creative work entirely in languages other than English? How do we negotiate a set of assessment standards that don't value these practices? Geeta, you're on silent.
Sorry, I can just very, very briefly, because I want to hear other people's perspectives, say that I think it starts from your syllabus and your reading. And of course, yes, you're absolutely right. The assessment criteria can sometimes, I think we're lucky we have a really small department, and my second markers and my externals are all very committed to the things that you've named. But it starts from having a syllabus that is very broad ranging, and that includes essays on things like translingual writing, multilinguality, different Englishes. So even if it's not on the official reading, I'll often give them extra things to read. So it starts with them, entering into the space where their required reading embraces all those things you've spoken of. Sabine, would you like to add anything? Because I know you have a lot of expertise in this area, because NYU is your parent institution in.
Unfortunately, I think this raises more questions than answers for me. Because although this is something that we promote, we do encourage students to be true and authentic to their own voice. I suppose it's different for creative writing, where there's more space for experimentation, more space for creativity. But when we teach academic writing, that idea of standardization still impeaches, especially where translanguaging is concerned. So, to be honest, the question is, how do we negotiate a set of assessment standards that don't value these practices? So I think it's at this moment, this realization, this awareness, this movement is more individual than collective, at least where I am, because I teach at NYU Abu Dhabi. It's a global campus, but it's based in UAE. So I think it is moving towards a collective practice, but right now I think there is still more work that needs to be done to bridge that gap. And I think, people like us who are pushing this, who are, talking about this, creating awareness, using this sort of experimentation in our own work, using the platform that we have to promote this, I think that's where it all starts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did anyone else want to add? Okay, shall we move on to another question? So Will asks, Will says that was a fantastic panel, and he wants to ask any of the panelists, could they share any experiences they have had on being mentored, formal or informal? How has it informed your own mentoring practice?
I'll start with that if that's. Sorry, Sabine, did you want to go first?
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about that. Will didn't specify writing, so I'm going to take this a little more broadly. My professional mentors have been primarily in South Asia, and it has been a very tough love kind of experience. But what I did take from it, the two that I'm thinking of were both men, and their way of mentoring was essentially to put me in situations that I had no experience of and say, you need to get the experience. And if you want to be taken seriously as a woman, a professional woman in South Asia, you will need to learn how to do this. Now, I would not take quite such a brutal approach to any of my mentees, and I think they would vouch for me on that. But I think there is something in terms of, when you're, especially with writing, because you're putting a piece of your soul on the page when you hand it over to anyone for creative writing. And, even though rationally that people may not like what you're writing or it may not be for them, it's difficult to accept with always with grace and always with with that understanding that everything isn't for everyone. So I think I think mentees can sometimes be worried about that, and I think mentors can also be a little concerned about a writer's writing style and their what they want to write. Their story is their own, and we would I think I speak for most of us when I say we would not want to encroach on those boundaries. But there are also points at which something is put forward and you can challenge a mentee on that, and in the process of engaging with you, it's an iterative process. They will understand certain things perhaps about their own writing. And that has been one of my experiences with Zara. In fact, we were talking about this recently. And so I think, that one should not be afraid sometimes to challenge assumptions or to challenge approaches, because often people have not thought that through themselves to that degree. They may discover that what they thought they wanted to say, they may still want to say, but perhaps not in the way that they initially said it. So I think that was very interesting for me. It's a non-writing mentor experience that I brought into the writing mentorship. And I think another one has just been with one of my writer friends, who is an unofficial mentor, and we critique each other's work as beta readers. But the number of things that I've learned from her and from one of the editors who I worked with, ironically, in fact, the editor that I referred to in the story that I pulled, she helped me to rework that entire story. It was quite still early on in my experience as a writer. And it was like, you know, a whole world opened up to me, because I had never thought, I have not been formally trained in writing. I have not studied literature. And so I come to writing as somebody who loves books and, you know, thought it would be amazing to be able to tell stories. And it was very interesting to have that opportunity with her. And even though I had to pull the story, I have to say that that experience of being mentored with her, by her, again informally, was very, very much something that I have brought into my mentoring experiences with the people that I work with, because it's a different way of seeing things. And sometimes you just need, you know, that thing about when you look at things differently, the things you look at become different. And it's a little bit like that, I think. People can often find dimensions that they were not aware of when they open up their minds and look at something. And that's one of the things I try to do with my mentees.
I'd love to. Sorry, Aisha, I spoke then at the same time. I was going to try and address some of the publishing questions as well. Shall I do that, or would you like to continue with the?
I think it'd be nice to hear maybe from a couple more people about like mentors and how your mentoring experience yourself may have impacted your mentoring. And then, yes, please do go ahead and address those other questions. Sabine, you wanted to?
Yeah, I can quickly just say that, you know, again, I think for me, when it comes to mentoring experience and, you know, my own experience as a mentee, I think it's really important to set expectations and and not be afraid to be clear about what you want from the feedback. You may be at a stage where you're just starting out and you don't want someone to just, you know, give you a whole lot of feedback. You may just be at that stage where you just want that sort of gentle nurturing to be able to, you know, have that confidence that, yes, my story matters. So I think one advice I would say is that don't be afraid to tell your mentor what you need at this stage. What kind of feedback you're looking for. And I think there's always a very fine line between giving feedback and receiving feedback. So I think it's important to be clear about that also. And also just keeping that balance between originality and accessibility. I'll just quickly add that in my own personal experience, I was unlucky to have received feedback very early on what I was trying to write rather than on my craft. And that I thought was a bit discouraging. So I try to be conscious and not do that. I'm very mindful that I don't tell writers, oh, you should be writing this instead of this, and just focus on the craft of writing. And I think I was lucky that I had sent one of my stories to the London magazine, and Sebastian Barker was the editor at that time, and he mentored me to write that story because it was not in the form that it was eventually when it was published, and constantly just, you know, very gentle sort of nurturing to really find what the story is trying to say. So I think, yeah, I would just say that to be, you know, mindful of what you're looking for and to find a good balance between receiving and giving feedback.
Thank you, Sabine. Amita, did you want to address the, oh, could I just say before, Amita, you look at those questions, I know some of the questions in the chat are specifically about Right Beyond Borders, the program. And what I'll do is send you a message later to tell you about the program itself, which it doesn't quite fit into the remit of what we're trying to discuss right now, but I will definitely address those questions via email. Amita?
I was just noticing that a couple of questions more specific to publishing had come up, so I was eager to make sure that we address them as well. I did want to say about mentoring that one of my rules anytime I give feedback is that I must say some really positive things first before I go on to constructive feedback, because I think if you just start with constructive feedback, I think it's very difficult for the person who's receiving it to take it in. So I think it's always really good first to go, these are the things that are working really wonderfully. So I just wanted to add that. There were a few publishing questions. One was from Sudha, who said, who was talking about kind of diversity at the back end of publishing, so in editors and agents. And Sudha, you're absolutely right that there is very little diversity when we look at editors in publishing houses and agents and PR people. And I think that is one of those things that, again, needs to be addressed so that when authors are with publishing houses, the publishing house kind of knows how to work with them. So I completely agree with you there. Someone else was asking if you are from outside the UK and you wanted to approach agents in this country. What I would say is, there's always this advice about getting writers and artists the book and looking through that. And I personally don't think that that's necessary to do kind of research online on agents and look at what they're acquiring, and are they motivated to really acquire fiction from diverse authors, or do their authors kind of look kind of similar? Think about that. Really think about whether they want to work with kind of diverse stories. And once you've done that research, because that's all available online, you can just really look at London literary agents, and you can look at each of their websites, and you can look at their range of authors. And I think having an idea of whether the agent knows how to work with diverse authors is a really good idea. And then approaching them just becomes that much easier. I'll just address one more, which is, how is a mentor different from a structural and developmental editor? I think, to me, when I get structural and developmental editing from an editor at my publishers, they are really just at that point sorting out things in the book. So, for example, there should be rising tension in the book. So if you've put that tension, if it isn't rising enough, they might say, actually, here we need a bit more tension, or here we need things to calm down a bit, that kind of thing. But a mentor is different. A mentor is meant to, offer encouragement. They're meant to see what you want from your publishing journey and help you with that. So it would be wrong of me as a mentor to go, okay, this is how you will get published, because that's not what the mentee is necessarily after. The mentee is after encouragement, developing a voice, potentially getting published, but they will have their own ideas about in what spaces they want to be published, in what kind of writer they want to be. And I think my job as a mentor is to listen to that and to pay attention to, what is their journey and what do they want, and how best can I help nurture that, versus the developmental edit, which is really about that project and how that project will then best be suited to being kind of out in the open and in the hands of customers.
I agree. And I just want to say that's a really good question, which often potential mentees are confused about. But, to kind of wrap up a couple of questions, I absolutely believe that your role as a mentor is to nurture, is to allow small shoots to grow into, large, healthy manuscripts, and shutting down people or, line by line editing is not something we would do. And to answer the previous question as well, I found that I haven't actually had official mentoring, but some of my old teachers who've become mentors, I found have a very nurturing, a very encouraging style. And that's the style I tend to use for my own mentoring. So I think it becomes a sort of like a mother-child process, the way that you were mentored and that you found useful is the way that you mentor potentially. And just to go back to the question in between, I just wanted to highlight these are not my agents, by the way, but there's an agency called the Good Literary Agency, which is run as a not-for-profit agency out of Bristol and London. And I know that they have a particular interest in acquiring diverse voices. I've met a couple of their agents at various publishing events, but they're not my agency. But I just wanted to say that if anyone's looking, that might be a place to start.
Thank you. There's one question here from Bate by Bate from Cameroon, and so for publishers looking to create a more experimental space that breaks away from standardization and connect with young writers to encourage authenticity and creativity in their writing, how do you do this, especially in a context where English thrives above mother tongues and existing publication models do not really favor avant-garde literature? So if anyone would like to pick that one up.
I almost feel that's a question for you and Susmita, Aisha, because you are doing this, by producing the anthology and so on. So, I mean, do one of you want to start off on that? Because I haven't actually set up any publishing concerns. So,
yeah, I think Amita wanted to answer, wanted to say something, and then yes, I think either Sushmita and I can also talk a little bit about our anthology.
It's very connected to what Geeta said, actually, because I was going to say, there is absolutely space for more experimental writing. It generally tends to be in things like the anthology that, that Geeta is referring to, and Wasafiri as the journal, so literary journals, indie publishers, they're much more likely to look at experimental writing, and I think there is absolutely space for that. It tends to be the big five that are a bit more, they have a different market model, but absolutely literary magazines, and Aisha can talk more about that, and Sushmita can talk more about that as well.
And can I just add that, we often think that the English language publishing industry only exists in the UK or the US, but there's a thriving English language industry outside Europe and America as well. India has a huge publishing industry. Pakistan has, now has 3 major publishers which publish in the English language. So don't be afraid to look outside Europe and US as well for publication. Singapore also has a publishing industry. So yeah, just wanted to add that.
I'm just going to add, Bate is specifically asking about how you think publishers might be able to do something like this, because I think that they're thinking about publishing themselves. It potentially is, they are a publisher themselves, and whether that's something that I guess it's about being brave and thinking about how you can build such spaces. Did anyone want to add about any of that?
I guess collaboration, because I'm involved with, at the moment, we've just finished judging an anthology of South Asian poetry, to which actually my mentee has contributed, and it's in conjunction with an independent press called Renard Press, and I know Comma Press also who are based in Manchester, do a lot of collaborations with, they have all this series which are like the City books based in different cities. So perhaps if you want to set up as an independent publishing concern, but you're concerned about, costs and how to make this get off the ground, collaboration with some of these small independent houses who are interested in highlighting voices from the country and can give you a kind of foot in the door, as it were, might be a great way to kind of begin. So collaboration amongst small independent concerns can be one way, I would say.
Thank you. Sushmita, did you want to come in and talk about our anthology? Because that's a really exciting collaboration with Dahlia Books. Yeah.
Yes, so that was really very, very exciting indeed for us. And as Geeta mentioned, collaboration. So finding out who are the independent presses, maybe, who are, interested in publishing diverse writing or, literature. So we approached Dahlia Books in the UK, and we've collaborated and, did the open call. I think it was a lot of it was through the open call, through social media, and the mentors shared amongst their networks, and we managed to get really, really interesting range of stories. So it is something that we have really enjoyed working on, and it's given us, I think, the confidence to create more such opportunities for writers. And it's been exciting and a big learning journey for us, who were not editors, or we are writers. We didn't really do the editing side of stuff, so we've learned along the way. And I guess what's happened is this is the way we grow. We identify as writers, and then we identify as maybe teachers, tutors, and now we are looking at the publishing side and actually trying to get books out. So that's been like a step-by-step process for us, and hopefully that will encourage others to look at it and say it can be done, and collaborating with others, joining in and doing things together, that could be a step forward.
And just to add about the anthology itself, we have 15 writers from across South Asia and other parts of the world. These are all writers who identify as being South Asian, but they're spread across the world, and all of them speak very many different languages. We're currently working on the cover of this anthology, and we've had 15 different languages that we are including on the cover itself. So we're really excited about this. We've got these stories from and lots of different perspectives from voices that you may not have heard before, but that will hopefully help sort of open up these stories and publishing a little bit more in the future. I think we don't have any other questions as such. There are some, as I've said, there are some specific questions that link to Right Beyond Borders, which I will address myself. Sushmita and I will address. I just want to thank Sushmita for working in the background, letting people in, spotlighting everyone, and just sort of organizing everything for this talk. I couldn't have done it without you, so thank you very much. And thank you to the 4 writers on the panel. It's been really, really helpful for people to hear everything that you've had to say, and just these wide-ranging and very instructive talks. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this, and to share these inspiring talks with us. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us, and all the very best, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha, Sushmita, Will, and all the fellow speakers. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's been a really, really intellectually stimulating discussion, hearing everyone and the questions. So thank you, and thank you, Aisha and Sushmita, for creating this space.